A homeless black man sat quietly on a bench, minding his own business, until two power-hungry cops decided he didn't belong. They shoved him, beat him, and left him bleeding on the pavement. What they didn't know? The man they just brutalized owned the entire police department, and now they're about to pay. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Let's get into it. A cold breeze swept through the empty street as Zaylen Wade sat on a worn-out bench outside a 24-hour convenience store. His tattered coat barely kept out the chill, and his rough hands, cracked from weeks of harsh weather, gripped an old paper cup filled with nothing but air. His dark eyes scanned the quiet surroundings, his face calm despite the exhaustion lining his features. The hum of a distant siren faded into the night, blending with the occasional sound of a car passing by. A single streetlight flickered above him, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. The store's glass door swung open with a sharp creak as a young cashier, Ruben Torres, stepped out to take out the trash. He glanced at Zaylen, offering a small nod before tossing the garbage into the dumpster. "You good, man?" Ruben asked hesitantly. He had seen Zaylen around before, never causing trouble, always quiet. Zaylen gave a slow nod, shifting slightly on the bench. "Just resting," he murmured, his voice steady. Ruben didn't push further. He knew the cops in this area didn't take kindly to people like Zaylen hanging around. "Be careful," he said before disappearing back inside. Just as the door shut behind Ruben, the low growl of an approaching police cruiser filled the air. The patrol car moved slowly, its headlights washing over Zaylen like a spotlight. Inside, Officer Grayson Holt sat behind the wheel, his fingers drumming against the steering wheel, while Officer Pierce Calloway leaned forward, narrowing his eyes at the man on the bench. "Looks like we got ourselves a loiterer," Pierce muttered, a smirk playing on his lips. Grayson let out a short chuckle, shaking his head. "Middle of the night, sitting outside a store. Bet he's waiting to do something stupid." Pierce grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, we got a possible vagrant loitering outside Jax's Market on 14th. Gonna check it out." There was a brief crackle before the reply came. "Copy that. Proceed." The tires crunched against the pavement as the car came to a slow stop. The doors swung open almost at the same time, and both officers stepped out, hands resting on their belts. Zaylen didn't move, his expression unreadable as the two men approached. "All right, let's go," Grayson barked. "Up, now!" Zaylen lifted his gaze, his face calm, but he didn't move. "I'm just sitting here," he said evenly. Pierce scoffed. "And now you're trespassing." He gestured toward the empty sidewalk. "You got somewhere else to be." Zaylen exhaled slowly, shifting slightly. "Public bench. Ain't hurting nobody." Grayson's patience thinned instantly. He hated when people like this acted like they had rights. "I said up. You either walk on your own or we help you." A few feet away, Ruben peeked through the glass, his stomach twisting. He had seen situations like this before. They never ended well. Zaylen knew what was coming. He had seen it before, felt it before, but he didn't move. His silence only made them angrier. Pierce stepped closer, his voice sharp. "You deaf!" I said. His hand shot out, gripping Zaylen's coat, yanking him forward. The cup in Zaylen's hands fell, rolling onto the pavement. Grayson grabbed his other arm, twisting it hard as they hauled him to his feet. Zaylen barely flinched. "You got ID?" Grayson demanded. "No." Pierce let out a laugh. "Of course you don't." The grip on his arms tightened, and before Zaylen could say another word, Grayson shoved him hard against the bench. "Empty your pockets," he ordered. Zaylen clenched his jaw, exhaling through his nose. "I got nothing." Grayson patted him down roughly, hands searching his coat, his jeans, his sleeves. His touch wasn't just for a search. It was meant to humiliate. "Nothing but lint," he muttered. Pierce took a step back, shaking his head. "You sleeping out here?" Zaylen didn't answer. Grayson's lips curled. "Smells like it." Behind the glass, Ruben tensed. He knew these cops. He had seen them harass people before, push them around just because they could. His fingers hovered over his phone, but fear kept him from dialing. Zaylen, still pressed against the bench, turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Grayson. I ain't breaking no law. Grayson's nostrils flared. He didn't like that look. Didn't like how this man, this nobody, was looking at him like an equal. You people are all the same, he muttered under his breath. That was all it took. Grayson slammed Zalen's head forward, his forehead smacking against the metal armrest of the bench. Pain exploded across his skull, but Zalen barely made a sound. Pierce grabbed his wrist, yanking it back at a painful angle. Stop resisting. Zalen wasn't resisting. He wasn't even moving. The weight of Grayson's knee pressed into his back, forcing him down further. His face scraped against the cold steel as a sharp pain burned through his shoulder. Ruben's hands shook as he pulled out his phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. Zalen, despite the pain, didn't yell. He didn't beg. He simply closed his eyes, breathing through the impact. The officers had no idea who they had just put their hands on. The air felt heavier as Zalen Wade remained pinned against the cold metal, his body absorbing each painful shift of pressure. The rough pavement dug into his knees as Officer Grayson Holt pressed down harder, his breath coming in short, amused huffs. Officer Pierce Calloway crouched beside him, smirking as he reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we got a non-compliant vagrant resisting arrest," Pierce said, his voice dripping with false urgency. Zalen's jaw tightened. He knew those words were meant to twist reality, to justify whatever came next. Behind the glass of the convenience store, Ruben Torres's hands trembled as he fumbled with his phone. He knew filming could make things worse, but doing nothing felt just as bad. He pressed record, his stomach twisting as the screen captured the scene outside. "Resisting?" Zalen muttered, his voice strained but steady. "I ain't done nothing." Grayson's grip tightened on the back of his coat. "That's where you're wrong." Without warning, a sharp punch landed against Zalen's ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. His body jerked slightly, but he didn't cry out. Grayson hit him again, the force sending another dull shock through his side. Ruben's breath hitched. He had never seen them go this far. A woman's voice suddenly cut through the air, sharp, firm, unafraid. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Grayson and Pierce turned sharply. Denise Holloway, an older woman from the neighborhood, stood near the curb, arms crossed over her chest. Her sharp eyes flickered between the officers and the battered man beneath them. "This man ain't done nothing," she snapped, stepping closer. "And you know it." Pierce let out a low chuckle. "Go back inside, ma'am. This ain't got nothing to do with you." Denise's face hardened. "It does when I see two grown men beating on someone who ain't fighting back." Grayson sighed, straightening. "Lady, step away before you—" "I said what I said," Denise cut him off, her voice like steel. "Let him go." More eyes were on them now. A few people had gathered across the street, their murmurs growing louder. Ruben held his phone higher, his hands steady now. Pierce nudged Grayson. "Cameras," he muttered. Grayson exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders as he glanced around. They had gotten too comfortable, forgotten where they were. "Lucky night," he muttered under his breath before yanking Zalen up by his collar and shoving him backward. Zalen stumbled but caught himself, his balance steady despite the pain. He lifted his gaze, staring directly at Grayson, his expression unreadable. Denise stepped between them. "Get in your damn car," she ordered. Pierce shot Grayson a look, annoyed but unwilling to make a bigger scene. "This ain't over," Grayson murmured, pointing a warning finger at Zalen. "Stay out of trouble." Zalen didn't answer. He simply dusted off his coat, his movements slow, controlled. Grayson scoffed before turning toward the car, Pierce following. The patrol vehicle pulled away, its red and blue lights reflecting off the store's windows before vanishing down the street. Denise turned to Zalen, eyes softening. "You all right?" Zalen rolled his shoulder, wincing slightly. "Been through worse." Ruben rushed out, his phone still clutched in his hand. "Man, I got everything," he said, his voice still shaken. "That video's going everywhere." Denise frowned. "You be careful with that." Zalen exhaled, staring at the empty street where the cops had just been. His voice was quiet, but there was something different in his tone now. "Don't worry," he murmured. "They're gonna know exactly who they messed with." The night had settled back into silence, but the weight of what had happened still clung to the air. Zalen Wade stood outside the convenience store, rolling his shoulder to shake off the lingering pain. Denise Holloway watched him carefully, her sharp eyes filled with something between concern and suspicion. "You sure you're all right?" she asked again. Zaylen gave a slow nod, his face unreadable. Ruben Torres stepped closer, still gripping his phone like it was a shield. The screen was lit. The video paused on the exact moment Grayson had slammed Zaylen against the bench. "I should post this now," Ruben muttered, his thumb hovering over the upload button. "People need to see this." Denise reached out, lowering his hand. "That ain't always the smartest move," she warned. "That video's proof, but it also puts a target on his back." She gestured toward Zaylen. "You sure you want that heat?" Zaylen met her gaze, his face unreadable. "Ain't about what I want," he said. "It's about what's right." Denise studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Just be careful. Cops like them, they don't take embarrassment lightly." Zaylen didn't respond. His mind was already elsewhere. Denise hesitated before reaching into her bag, pulling out a few crumpled bills. "Here, get yourself something warm to eat." Zaylen glanced at the money but didn't take it. Instead, he met her gaze, a small, knowing smirk flickering across his face for the first time. "I appreciate the kindness," he said slowly, "but I don't need it." Denise frowned slightly, her eyes narrowing. Something about his tone, about the way he carried himself, didn't match the worn clothes on his back. Before she could press further, the rumble of an engine filled the air. A sleek, black SUV pulled up along the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the glow of the streetlights. The vehicle didn't belong in this neighborhood. It was too clean, too expensive. Zaylen barely reacted. He simply exhaled through his nose, like he had been expecting it. The back door swung open, and a tall man in a sharp gray suit stepped out. Gabriel Langford, his personal attorney. Denise and Ruben exchanged quick, confused glances as Gabriel adjusted his cufflinks and shut the door behind him. His presence was immediate, controlled, powerful. He didn't look at Denise or Ruben. His sharp gaze landed directly on Zaylen. "You good?" Gabriel asked, his tone smooth, professional. Zaylen gave a slow nod. "Took him longer than I thought." Denise's lips parted slightly. Something about this didn't make sense. A man dressed like that, a car like that, pulling up for someone like Zaylen? Gabriel turned his head, finally acknowledging the others. His expression didn't change, but his tone softened slightly. "Thank you both for looking out," he said. "I'll take it from here." Denise stepped back, crossing her arms. "Who are you?" Gabriel gave her a small, polite smile. "Just someone making sure the right people answer for what they did tonight." Ruben's grip on his phone tightened. "Wait, what's going on?" Zaylen met his eyes, his own gaze steady. "You'll see soon enough." Without another word, he stepped toward the SUV, climbing inside. Gabriel followed, shutting the door behind them. The car pulled away, leaving Denise and Ruben standing in stunned silence. Denise exhaled, shaking her head. "Something ain't right," she muttered. Ruben stared at the now empty street, the video still paused on his screen. "No," he said quietly. "Something's just getting started." The inside of the SUV was silent as it glided through the city streets. Zaylen Wade sat in the back seat, his fingers resting lightly on his knee, his face calm despite the bruise forming on his cheekbone. Across from him, Gabriel Langford adjusted his tie, his sharp gaze scanning Zaylen's injuries. "They put hands on you," Gabriel said, more of a statement than a question. Zaylen exhaled, rolling his shoulders slightly. "Could have been worse." Gabriel's jaw tightened. "You could have stopped this before it even started." Zaylen smirked slightly, shaking his head. "And missed the show." The driver, Elliot Crane, glanced at them through the rear-view mirror. He was a man of few words, but his expression showed he was just as displeased. "They crossed the line," Elliot muttered. "You want me to handle it?" Zaylen lifted a hand slightly, signaling no. "Not yet." Gabriel let out a slow breath, leaning back in his seat. "You knew this was going to happen." Zaylen's smirk faded slightly. "I needed to see it for myself." Gabriel scoffed, shaking his head. "And now you've seen it. A couple of low-ranking officers abusing their authority. What's next?" Zaylen's dark eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Now they learn." Elliot turned the car down a private street, the city lights fading behind them. The road led to a secured high-rise building, its modern glass exterior reflecting the skyline. At the entrance, private security stood at attention, nodding as the SUV pulled up. Zaylen stepped out first, adjusting his worn coat as Gabriel followed beside him. From the outside, anyone would still mistake him for a homeless man. Tattered clothes, unshaven, a man who had seen too many hard nights. But as they entered the building lobby, the illusion faded. Every employee inside, from the security at the front desk to the receptionist, working late, straightened the moment they saw him. Some nodded respectfully. Others quickly stepped out of the way. Gabriel glanced at his watch. "We've got a meeting in 10 minutes. You sure you don't want to change first?" Zaylen smirked, shaking his head. "I want them to see me like this." They stepped into a private elevator, the doors sliding shut behind them. Elliot remained in the car, but Gabriel pressed the highest floor button, glancing at Zaylen once more. "You're making this personal." Zaylen finally looked at him, his voice calm but firm. "It is personal." The elevator ascended smoothly, the city shrinking below them. As it neared the top, Gabriel exhaled sharply, knowing exactly what was about to happen. When the doors finally slid open, the chief of police, Gerald Whitaker, was already waiting for them. The tension in the private conference room was thick the moment Zaylen Wade and Gabriel Langford stepped inside. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glowing city skyline, but all eyes in the room were locked on Chief Gerald Whitaker, who sat stiffly at the long glass table. Beside him, Deputy Commissioner Lionel Graves leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, watching Zaylen with careful calculation. A few other high-ranking officials from the department were present, their expressions ranging from uneasy to outright nervous. They had been summoned, but none of them fully understood why. Chief Whitaker cleared his throat, forcing a strained smile. "Mr. Wade," he greeted, though his voice lacked warmth. "I was surprised to hear you requested a meeting so late." Zaylen strode forward at an easy pace, his tattered coat still draped over his shoulders, making a stark contrast against the polished suits in the room. He moved like a man with nothing to prove, yet held a presence that made even the most powerful men uncomfortable. Gabriel took the seat beside him, setting a folder on the table, but Zaylen remained standing, his fingers pressing against the cool glass surface as he leaned forward slightly. "I had an interesting night," Zaylen said casually. The chief forced another weak chuckle. "I see that. You look like hell?" Zaylen finished for him, smirking. "Yeah, that's what happens when two of your officers decide to play executioner outside a convenience store." A tense silence spread through the room. Graves uncrossed his arms, sitting forward. "What officers?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Zaylen's expression darkened. "Grayson Holt and Pierce Calloway." Chief Whitaker sighed heavily, rubbing a hand over his forehead. "I was afraid of that." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "Afraid? That's an interesting word choice, considering they work under you." The chief shot him a look, but didn't respond. Zaylen finally pulled out a flash drive from his pocket and tossed it onto the table. It slid across the polished surface, stopping near the chief's hand. "That's the footage," Zaylen said. "Clear as day. Your officers beating a man on the street for nothing." Whitaker picked up the drive hesitantly, glancing toward the others before looking back at Zaylen. "And I assume you didn't come here just to show us this." Zaylen's smirk returned, slow and deliberate. "Oh, I came for more than that." Graves folded his hands together. "All right, let's cut through the theatrics." His sharp gaze locked onto Zaylen. "You wouldn't be here if you didn't already have the leverage to demand something. So tell us, what do you want?" The room stilled. Even Whitaker shifted uncomfortably. Zaylen tilted his head slightly, studying them. Then, in a voice that was calm, controlled, and undeniable, he spoke. "I own this department." A heavy silence followed. The chief blinked, confused. "Excuse me?" Zaylen straightened, pulling out another folder from inside his coat. He slid it across the table, the movement slow and deliberate. Gabriel leaned back, letting the tension settle. "It's all there," he said smoothly. "The funding reports, the property ownership records, and the investment trails leading back to the Wade Family Trust." Whitaker grabbed the folder, flipping through the pages, his expression shifting from confusion to growing horror. Zaylen leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the words hit harder. I own the land this department sits on. I control a significant share of the funding that runs your budget. Every paycheck, every vehicle, every piece of equipment, it runs through channels that trace back to me. The realization settled across the room like a crushing weight. Graves swallowed. That can't be right. It is, Gabriel cut in, adjusting his cufflinks. Mr. Wade has spent years, quietly, building a financial grip on this city's law enforcement infrastructure. And let's just say, his generosity can end whenever he chooses. Chief Whitaker's hand trembled slightly as he set the papers down. Zaylen smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. So, I think the better question is, what are you going to do about the two men who just beat the hell out of your boss? The silence in the conference room stretched, heavy and suffocating. Chief Gerald Whitaker opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His fingers twitched over the folder, the reality of the situation sinking in. Deputy Commissioner Lionel Graves was no better. His carefully composed expression had cracked, replaced by something resembling shock. Zaylen Wade sat back in his chair, arms resting loosely on the armrests, watching them with quiet amusement. He had seen this reaction before. Powerful men realizing too late that they were no longer in control. Whitaker finally let out a sharp breath, his voice strained. You can't expect me to just fire two officers on the spot. Zaylen tilted his head slightly. Can I? Graves interjected, trying to regain some authority. Internal investigations don't work that way, Mr. Wade. There's a process. Zaylen cut him off with a quiet chuckle. You think I care about your process? Graves stiffened. Gabriel Langford, ever the composed attorney, leaned forward slightly. Chief, let's not pretend we don't know how this works. You and I both know that if these were different circumstances, if the man they attacked was anyone else, you'd be backing them up right now, stalling, running damage control. Whitaker's jaw clenched. Gabriel continued. But this isn't just any case, and that's not just any man sitting across from you. His gaze flicked toward Zaylen. So, again, let's be clear. How are you going to handle this? Whitaker leaned back, rubbing his temples, his frustration barely contained. He looked toward Graves, but the deputy commissioner didn't speak. He was still processing the revelation that they had been working under Zaylen Wade this entire time without knowing it. I need time, Whitaker muttered. Zaylen's smirk faded. Time for what? Whitaker hesitated. To handle it cleanly, I can't just terminate officers without going through the right channels. The union... Zaylen exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I don't give a damn about the union. Graves cleared his throat. You're asking us to publicly take down two of our own. That alone would cause serious backlash. And if we don't handle it right, it could turn into a media circus. That's bad for everyone, including you. Zaylen studied him for a moment. So, what you're saying is, you need a reason bigger than they beat a man for no damn reason. Neither man answered. Gabriel sighed, glancing at Zaylen. They're looking for an angle that protects them. Zaylen exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. He could see it in their faces. They weren't just afraid of him pulling his financial support. They were afraid of the power shift happening right in front of them. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Fine, he said. I'll give you something even better. Graves frowned. And what's that? Zaylen's smirk returned, slow and deliberate. You're worried about a media circus? Good, because when I'm done, the entire city is going to be watching. Whitaker's breath hitched slightly. Zaylen's voice dropped just enough to send a chill through the room. You've got 24 hours to handle this your way. After that, his gaze darkened. I handle it my way. The weight of Zaylen Wade's words settled over the room like a storm cloud. Chief Gerald Whitaker gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white, while Deputy Commissioner Lionel Graves shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension was thick, pressing, and undeniable. Graves cleared his throat. And if we don't meet your deadline? Zaylen's smirk didn't fade. Then you'll find out what it's like when the people you protect stop protecting you. Whitaker's lips pressed into a thin line. You're playing a dangerous game, Mr. Wade. Zaylen chuckled, shaking his head. No, Chief. I own the board. The silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just shock. It was fear. They had underestimated him. They had treated him like he was invisible. Now they were realizing their mistake in real time. Whitaker exhaled, rubbing his temple. I'll make the calls. Zaylen stood, adjusting his tattered coat as he glanced at Gabriel Langford, who gave him a small, knowing nod. Their work here was done. For now. Just as Zaylen turned toward the elevator, Graves's voice stopped him. There's something you should know, Graves said, his voice careful, measured. Zaylen paused but didn't turn around. Go on. Graves hesitated before speaking. Grayson Holt and Pierce Calloway aren't just random officers. They're connected. Holt's father was an old-school precinct captain, had deep roots in this department before he retired. Calloway, he's got ties to the mayor's office. Gabriel raised an eyebrow. And? Graves sighed. And that means they've got people looking out for them. You want them gone? Fine. But don't think for a second they won't fight back. Zaylen finally turned, his gaze steady, unreadable. Let them. With that, he stepped into the elevator, Gabriel following behind him. As the doors slid shut, Chief Whitaker let out a long breath, his face pale. Graves leaned back in his chair, staring at the folder Zaylen had left on the table. God help us, he muttered, because I don't think anyone else can stop what's coming. The elevator descended smoothly, the hum of the machinery the only sound between Zaylen Wade and Gabriel Langford. Gabriel stood with his arms crossed, his sharp gaze locked on Zaylen, who leaned against the wall, hands stuffed into the tattered pockets of his coat. You know they're not just going to let this slide, Gabriel finally said. Zaylen exhaled slowly, tilting his head slightly. I'm counting on it, Gabriel scoffed, shaking his head. You just threatened the highest-ranking officers in the department. You think they're going to roll over and fire two of their own without a fight? Zaylen's smirk was barely visible, but it was there. That's exactly what I think. Gabriel studied him for a moment before sighing. You want them to push back. You want them to panic. Zaylen finally turned his head, his dark eyes steady. A man like Whitaker? He's desperate to keep his house in order. But a man like Grayson Holt? He's too damn arrogant to stay quiet. He's gonna fight this. And when he does, he's gonna show the whole world exactly who he is. The elevator chimed as the doors slid open, revealing the private parking garage. Elliot Crane was already waiting beside the black SUV, his arms folded across his chest. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze flicked between them. Gabriel climbed into the passenger seat, while Zaylen slid into the back, stretching out slightly as Elliot got behind the wheel. As soon as the doors shut, Elliot started the car and glanced at Zaylen through the rearview mirror. How'd it go? Zaylen smirked. Exactly how I wanted it to. Elliot shook his head. You're playing with fire. Zaylen let out a quiet chuckle. I'm not playing. I'm lighting the whole damn thing up. Elliot didn't respond. He just pulled the car onto the road, weaving through the late-night traffic as they headed toward Zaylen's private estate, a place most people didn't even know existed. But before they could get far, Gabriel's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen. His eyebrows lifted slightly before he answered. Langford. A voice on the other end spoke quickly, tension clear in the tone. Gabriel's face remained neutral, but his grip on the phone tightened. Zaylen watched him carefully. Problem? Gabriel let out a slow breath, lowering the phone. Looks like Holt and Calloway aren't wasting any time. Zaylen's smirk widened slightly. What did they do? Gabriel turned to face him. They filed a report against you. Elliot scoffed, glancing at them through the mirror. For what? Gabriel's voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it. Assaulting an officer, interfering with an investigation, resisting arrest. Zaylen's smirk didn't fade. Let me guess. They left out the part where they were stomping me into the pavement? Gabriel exhaled sharply. Not only that, they're spinning the whole thing. There's a press statement being drafted claiming you became aggressive during questioning, that they had no choice but to use force. Elliot cursed under his breath. They're setting up a defense. Gabriel nodded. They're making this a case of, he said, they said. and they've got the full force of the department backing them. Zalen leaned his head back against the seat, letting out a slow breath. Exactly what he expected. Elliot glanced back again. This what you wanted? Zalen's eyes opened slightly, a sharp glint in them. This is better than what I wanted. Gabriel frowned. How the hell do you figure that? Zalen sat forward slightly, his fingers interlacing. They just made it clear they're willing to fight this publicly. His smirk returned, but this time it was sharper. That means they've given me permission to do the same. Gabriel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. You're really about to make this a war, aren't you? Zalen's voice was quiet, controlled. It already is. The weight of the situation settled in the SUV, but Zalen Wade was as calm as ever. The streets outside blurred past as Elliot Crane navigated the late-night traffic. But inside the vehicle, tension hung thick in the air. Gabriel Langford leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he let out a slow breath. All right, he muttered. They fired the first shot. What's your move? Zalen didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gazed out the window, watching the distant glow of the city skyline. The pieces were moving exactly how he wanted. But now it was time to push things further. His voice was steady when he finally spoke. I want everything on Holt and Calloway. Gabriel smirked slightly. Already ahead of you. He pulled out his phone, tapping a few times before turning the screen toward Zalen. I had my team start digging the second we left that meeting. Zalen's eyes scanned the files Gabriel had pulled up. It wasn't just basic personnel records. It was deeper. Years of internal complaints, buried misconduct reports, off-the-books arrests that had been quietly swept away. A history of excessive force, a pattern of targeting minorities. Zalen exhaled slowly. And I'm guessing none of this ever made it past the official channels. Gabriel shook his head. Covered up, redirected, hidden under departmental discretion. He scrolled down, stopping at one particular entry. But this is where things get interesting. Elliot glanced at them through the mirror. What is it? Gabriel tapped the screen. 3 years ago, Holt and Calloway were involved in an off-the-record raid, one that resulted in an unarmed teenager getting killed. Zalen's gaze darkened. And let me guess, the report said he posed a threat. Gabriel nodded. They framed him as a gang member, claimed he was reaching for a weapon. But the truth? He exhaled. There was never a weapon. The kid had his hands up. Elliot clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. And they got away with it. Zalen tapped his fingers against the armrest. Because someone covered for them. Gabriel nodded. That's the part we need to figure out. The report never specifies who made the call to clear them. But if we find that person, he trailed off, his meaning clear. Zalen smirked. Then we don't just take down 2 cops, we take down everyone who protected them. The SUV slowed as it approached the secured gated entrance of Zalen's private estate. The security guards outside immediately stepped aside, nodding as the gates opened. As they pulled in, Gabriel's phone buzzed again. He checked the screen, his expression shifting. Zalen raised an eyebrow. More bad news? Gabriel sighed. Not exactly. But it looks like Holt and Calloway aren't the only ones making moves. Zalen frowned. Who else is getting involved? Gabriel leaned back. The mayor's office. Elliot let out a low whistle. That was fast. Gabriel nodded. Word's spreading. It's no longer just about you and those 2 idiots. The city's higher-ups are getting nervous. Zalen chuckled, shaking his head. Good. Let them be nervous. Gabriel's expression remained serious. We need to be careful. The more powerful the people involved, the more dangerous this gets. If you keep pushing, they'll come at you with everything. Zalen's smirk faded slightly. His voice, however, remained calm. They already did. He unbuttoned his coat slightly, revealing the bruises along his ribs, the scrape on his forehead from when his face was smashed against the bench. This, he gestured at himself, this was them making their move, and they did it thinking I was nothing. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. Now they're going to find out exactly what happens when you put your hands on the wrong man. Gabriel exhaled, nodding slightly. All right, then we do this on our terms. Elliot parked the SUV in front of the private entrance to Zalen's estate, shutting off the engine. Gabriel turned to him. I'll have my team pull every record, find every weak link, but you need to decide, how far are we going with this? Zaylen didn't hesitate. All the way. The night air was crisp as Zaylen Wade stepped out of the SUV, his boots pressing against the smooth stone of his private estate's driveway. The towering structure before him, a sleek but understated modern home, stood in stark contrast to the tattered coat still draped over his shoulders. It wasn't a palace, wasn't excessive. It was built for function, for control, and right now control was exactly what he needed. Elliot Crane shut the car door behind him, scanning the area out of instinct. Gabriel Langford followed at a slower pace, scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. He was still processing the latest development. The mayor's office was getting involved. Zaylen walked toward the entrance, the automatic security system recognizing him immediately. The doors unlocked with a soft click, and the trio stepped inside. The interior was sleek, minimalistic. Dark wood, stone accents, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. But Zaylen didn't pause to admire the view. He shrugged off his coat, tossing it over the back of a chair as he made his way to a large glass desk in the center of the main room. A row of multiple monitors flickered to life the moment he sat down. Gabriel finally looked up from his phone. "All right, let's break this down," he said, his voice all business. "We've got Holt and Calloway filing a false report against you. We've got Whitaker and Graves stuck between protecting their own and saving their own necks. And now the mayor's office has decided to step in." Elliot leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Means they're scared. The last thing politicians want is messy police scandals making headlines." Gabriel nodded. "Exactly. Which tells us one thing. Holt and Calloway aren't just disposable pawns. They have connections high up." Zaylen leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "The question is, how deep does it go?" Gabriel sat on the edge of the desk, rubbing his temple. "Well, that depends on how much we want to push. We can take the easy route, force Whitaker to fire them, let them take the fall, and move on. Or," he glanced at Zaylen, "we pull the whole system apart." Zaylen smirked slightly. "You already know my answer." Elliot chuckled under his breath. "Thought so." Gabriel sighed. "All right, then we need evidence. Something that forces the mayor's office to back off instead of defending them." He gestured toward the monitors. "We have the footage of them beating you, but we need more. We need something that proves corruption at a level that makes this impossible to bury." Zaylen turned his chair toward the monitors, fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "Then let's find it." With a few keystrokes, the screen split into multiple security feeds, police reports, and data logs. Zaylen didn't just control the funding behind the department. He had spent years securing access to internal systems, leaked documents, hidden communications. "All right," he muttered, scrolling through data at an almost mechanical speed. "Let's start with the basics." Elliot and Gabriel watched as lines of confidential police logs filled the screens. Incident reports, officer complaints, department audits. It was an entire system of secrets, and Zaylen had the keys. Gabriel let out a low whistle. "You've been sitting on this for a while." Zaylen smirked. "A man in my position? Always good to have insurance." Then suddenly, he paused. His eyes narrowed as he clicked on a specific officer misconduct report buried beneath routine paperwork. He read it once, then again. His expression remained neutral, but his grip on the mouse tightened. Elliot noticed immediately. "What is it?" Zaylen exhaled through his nose. "It's not just Holt and Calloway." Gabriel frowned. "What do you mean?" Zaylen turned to them, his expression unreadable. "They weren't working alone that night." Gabriel's eyes widened slightly. "There were more officers?" Zaylen nodded. "At least 4, maybe more." Elliot pushed off the wall, standing straight. "And let me guess, none of them were ever named in the official reports." Zaylen's jaw tightened. "Exactly." Gabriel ran a hand through his hair. "If that's true, then this isn't just about 2 corrupt cops. This is an entire network." Zaylen leaned back, his smirk returning, but this time it was colder, calculated. "Then it looks like we're about to burn the whole thing down." The room was silent, except for the soft hum of the monitors, casting a faint glow over Zaylen Wade's face as he scrolled through the newly uncovered records. The deeper he went, the uglier it became. Officer Grayson Holt and Officer Pierce Calloway weren't just two rogue cops abusing their authority. They were part of a systemic operation, protected at every level. Zalen's fingers tapped against the desk rhythmically as his eyes scanned the documents. Names started appearing: officers, supervisors, legal advisors, even city officials. It wasn't just about what happened to him that night. This ran deep. Elliot Crane crossed his arms, standing behind him. His sharp eyes flickered over the screens, taking in the long list of buried complaints, manipulated evidence, and witness intimidation. He let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "We were looking for dirt on two cops. We just found a whole damn graveyard." Gabriel Langford, sitting on the edge of the desk, exhaled slowly. "This isn't just police misconduct," he said. "This is organized corruption, evidence tampering, false arrests, disappearances. Hell, this even mentions falsified homicide reports." Zalen's jaw tightened slightly. "How long has this been going on?" Gabriel scrolled through a separate file, eyes scanning the timeline. "Years," he muttered. "Holt and Calloway were just foot soldiers when they started. But as their names disappeared from reports, as complaints vanished from records, they got bolder, and someone kept protecting them." Elliot leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Who?" Gabriel's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, searching for patterns, connections. His expression darkened. "It's not just one person. It's an entire chain." A hierarchy of corruption revealed itself. Complaints would be filed against officers like Holt and Calloway, only for them to be rerouted, dismissed, or lost before they could be investigated. At the top of the chain, a name appeared: Deputy Commissioner Lionel Graves. Elliot let out a bitter laugh. "Should have known." Gabriel rubbed his temple. "It makes sense. Whitaker might be the public face of the department. But Graves?" He gestured to the screen. "He's the one pulling the strings." Zalen exhaled slowly. His eyes never left the screen, but his mind was already 10 steps ahead. "Graves is smart," he murmured. "He keeps his hands clean. He lets guys like Holt and Calloway do the dirty work, and when things get too loud, he makes the evidence disappear." Gabriel nodded. "That's exactly what's been happening." He leaned forward, pointing at a file. "This report, 3 years ago, after a botched raid left an unarmed teenager dead. The case was investigated by Internal Affairs, and just before charges could be filed, the lead investigator was reassigned. Case dismissed." Elliot scoffed. "Let me guess. Graves was the one who authorized the reassignment?" Gabriel smirked slightly. "Bingo." Zalen's fingers steepled in front of him, his expression unreadable. "And now he thinks he can bury this again." Elliot straightened. "So what's the play?" Zalen finally turned his chair toward them, a slow smirk forming. "We make sure this never gets buried again." Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "How do you propose we do that?" Zalen tapped the screen. "By making sure the whole world sees it." Elliot narrowed his eyes. "You want to go public with this?" Zalen's smirk widened slightly. "Not just yet. First, we let Graves and his little network think they still have control." Gabriel tilted his head. "And then?" Zalen's voice was calm, deliberate. "Then we take everything from them." A brief silence followed. Elliot and Gabriel exchanged a look. They had seen Zalen like this before. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about breaking the system that let this happen. Elliot exhaled. "All right, where do we start?" Zalen leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "First, we push Whitaker." Gabriel nodded. "He's already desperate. He knows Holt and Calloway are a liability, but he's stalling." Zalen smirked. "Then we force his hand." Elliot crossed his arms. "How?" Zalen's smirk turned cold. "We turn up the pressure." He gestured toward the monitors. "Gabriel, I need you to leak specific files. Just enough to make the public start asking questions, but not everything. Not yet." Gabriel nodded, already pulling up his contacts. "And what about Holt and Calloway?" Zalen's voice remained steady. "They'll be too busy watching their own backs to see what's coming next." Elliot smirked. "And Graves?" Zalen's eyes darkened. "Oh, he won't see it coming at all." The plan was already in motion before the city even realized it. Gabriel Langford worked through the night, carefully selecting which files to leak, ensuring the right hands would receive them. The goal wasn't to reveal everything at once, just enough to create whispers, stir curiosity, and make the department nervous. By morning, the first news article dropped. Leaked internal complaints suggest years of police misconduct, covered up by department insiders. The article, published by a reputable independent journalist, didn't mention any names yet, but it outlined a pattern of abuse, pointing to officers who had miraculously escaped consequences despite repeated complaints. Social media picked up the story almost immediately. By midday, more reports followed, each one digging a little deeper. The public wasn't just talking, they were demanding answers. Inside police headquarters, the reaction was immediate. Chief Gerald Whitaker sat in his office, his phone buzzing with endless calls. Every headline, every breaking news alert felt like a noose tightening around his neck. His department was already under scrutiny, but this was an active storm. A sharp knock at the door made him look up. Deputy Commissioner Lionel Graves entered without waiting for an invitation, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. Whitaker let out a slow breath. "Tell me you have this under control." Graves closed the door behind him, his movements deliberate, calculated. "I'm working on it," he said smoothly. Whitaker scoffed. "Working on it? My entire department is about to be ripped apart in the press. I have reporters calling for statements, the mayor's office breathing down my neck, and now I've got officers panicking, asking if they're about to be sacrificed." Graves didn't flinch. "That's exactly why you need to calm down." Whitaker leaned forward, his voice dropping. "This isn't some routine PR disaster, Lionel. This is an attack. Someone planned this." Graves exhaled slowly, walking toward the window. He already knew who was behind it. Zaylen Wade. The timing, the precision, it wasn't a coincidence. Whitaker leaned back in his chair, running a hand down his face. "We need to get ahead of this before it spirals." Graves turned to face him, his eyes cold. "We need a distraction." Whitaker frowned. "What kind of distraction?" Graves took a slow step forward. "One that shifts the conversation. Right now, the media is focused on misconduct. We need them to focus on something else." Whitaker's stomach twisted. He had worked with Graves long enough to know when he was about to do something reckless. "Lionel, whatever you're thinking, be careful." Graves smirked slightly. "Don't worry, Gerald. I'm always careful." With that, he turned and walked out of the office, pulling out his phone as he disappeared down the hall. Meanwhile, across the city, Zaylen Wade sat in his private office, watching the media storm unfold in real time. He wasn't celebrating. This was just the beginning. Elliot Crane stood near the window, phone in hand. "Whitaker's scrambling," he said. "I got word that officers are nervous. Some are asking if they should start lawyering up." Gabriel leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "And Graves?" Elliot smirked. "Silent, which means he's planning something." Zaylen nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against the desk. "He's predictable," he murmured. "He's not going to try and fight this head on. He's going to redirect." Gabriel exhaled. "Then the question is, what's his next move?" Later that night, the city had barely caught its breath from the morning's headlines when a breaking news alert interrupted regular programming. Police chief announces major crackdown on gang activity following disturbing new intelligence. Zaylen stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Gabriel cursed under his breath. "There's your distraction." The news anchor continued. "Chief Whitaker, alongside Deputy Commissioner Lionel Graves, has announced an immediate increase in law enforcement operations targeting violent gang-related crime. This move comes in response to what authorities are calling a dangerous rise in criminal activity, though details remain limited." Zaylen exhaled slowly, his gaze dark. "They're staging a show of force." Elliot's expression was tight. "You know what this means, right?" Zaylen nodded. "They're going to turn up the heat on the streets. More stops, more arrests. They're going to hit the neighborhoods hardest, the ones that can't fight back." Gabriel ran a hand down his face. "This is straight out of the old playbook. They get accused of corruption, so they overcompensate by pretending they're cleaning up crime. It puts the media on their side and makes anyone calling them out look like they're soft on crime." Elliot scoffed. And the worst part? It works. Zalen's gaze never left the screen. This wasn't just about Holt and Calloway anymore. Graves had just upped the stakes. Gabriel sighed. So what's the play? Zalen leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. His voice was calm but laced with fire. We stopped them. Elliot raised an eyebrow. You want to go against the department while they're in full law and order mode? Zalen's smirk returned. Sharp, cold, unshaken. They want to put on a show, he said. Fine. We'll give them one they'll never forget. The city streets were restless by the next morning. Patrol cars prowled neighborhoods, their flashing lights casting ominous glows against the sidewalks. Officers set up aggressive checkpoints, questioning people at random, pulling over cars, stopping anyone who looked like they didn't belong. It was a blunt show of power, designed to change the conversation and remind people who was really in control. But behind the scenes, Zalen Wade was already 10 steps ahead. Inside his estate, the atmosphere was razor sharp. Elliot Crane leaned against the desk, arms crossed, watching as Gabriel Langford sorted through a fresh batch of reports flooding in from their informants. Zalen sat at the center of it all, calm, focused, calculating. Gabriel let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. They've got 20 new arrests since last night. And guess what? He tapped the screen in front of him. Not a single one of them is an actual gang member. Elliot scoffed. Figures. Zalen leaned forward, scrolling through the reports. They're targeting easy arrests. People with records, people who won't have the resources to fight back. Gabriel nodded. And the media? They're eating it up. City takes swift action against crime surge. He shook his head. They're setting up a narrative. By the time we get the truth out, people will already believe the lie. Elliot exhaled sharply. So how do we flip the script? Zalen smirked slightly. We make them play defense. Gabriel raised an eyebrow. How? Zalen tapped the desk, thinking. Then he turned to Elliot. We still have that contact in the forensics division? Elliot's eyes narrowed slightly before a slow grin formed. Yeah, she owes us. Zalen's smirk widened. Good. I want the unedited arrest reports. Every officer's name, every detail before they sanitize them for the press. Gabriel caught on immediately. You're looking for patterns. Zalen nodded. If Graves is pushing this crackdown, it means they're fabricating at least some of the charges. We find the inconsistencies, we break the entire operation wide open. Elliot pulled out his phone, already dialing. I'll get it done. As he stepped out to make the call, Gabriel exhaled, watching Zalen carefully. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Zalen gave a slow smirk, but there was no humor in it. I don't enjoy it, he said. I just don't lose. Gabriel chuckled, shaking his head. And what happens when Graves realizes he's losing? Zalen leaned back, his eyes darkening. Then he does something desperate. Across the city, police headquarters, Deputy Commissioner Lionel Graves was already 3 steps ahead of his own. He stood in a dimly lit office, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the skyline. Behind him, Grayson Holt and Pierce Calloway sat stiffly, waiting for him to speak. Graves took a slow sip before finally turning. The media is on our side for now, but that won't last. You two have already drawn too much attention. Holt clenched his jaw. Sir, we're being targeted. That video, it's been twisted. We didn't do anything that any other cop wouldn't have done. Graves exhaled sharply. That may be true, but the problem is, you did it to the wrong man. Calloway frowned. You're telling us some homeless bum has this much pull? Graves' expression darkened. You're still thinking about this like he's a nobody. That's your mistake. He walked over to his desk, pulling out a confidential file. Zalen Wade isn't just some vagrant off the streets. He's been watching this department for years. Holt's brows furrowed. Watching? Graves nodded. More than that. He tossed the file onto the desk, and the 2 officers leaned forward. The documents inside showed exactly what Graves had just uncovered. Property records, investment trails, ownership stakes in the city's law enforcement infrastructure. Calloway's mouth tightened. You're telling me he… Yes. Graves's tone was clipped. He owns us. A heavy silence followed. Finally, Holt exhaled, his mind racing. So what do we do? Graves slowly smirked, his eyes sharp. We do what we should have done from the start. Calloway frowned. Which is? Graves stepped closer, lowering his voice. We remind him that money doesn't make you untouchable. Holt's grip tightened. You want us to take him out? Graves chuckled, shaking his head. Nothing so crude. He turned back toward the window. We hit him where it hurts. He glanced at them over his shoulder. Find out who he cares about. Back at Zaylen's estate, the night stretched on as Elliot returned, tossing a USB drive onto the desk. Got it. Zaylen plugged it in, pulling up the unedited reports. As his eyes flickered over the details, his smirk faded. Gabriel noticed immediately. What is it? Zaylen's fingers clenched slightly. They aren't just fabricating charges, he exhaled. They're targeting specific people. Elliot leaned forward. Who? Zaylen's jaw tightened. Then he turned the screen toward them. Gabriel's face darkened as he read the list. Names. People connected to Zaylen. A former employee. A childhood friend. Ruben Torres, the cashier who recorded the video. Elliot cursed under his breath. They're making examples out of them. Gabriel ran a hand through his hair. Graves is going after everyone in your orbit. Zaylen sat still for a long moment. Then finally he stood. They just made a mistake. Gabriel sighed. And what's that? Zaylen's eyes burned with a cold intensity. They thought I'd let them get away with it. He grabbed his coat, already heading toward the door. Elliot frowned. Where are we going? Zaylen didn't stop. To end this. The SUV tore through the city streets, its engine humming low under the weight of the mission ahead. Zaylen Wade sat in the back, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were anything but. A quiet storm brewed behind them, the kind of stillness that came before the collapse of something powerful. Elliot Crane drove with one hand on the wheel, the other gripping his phone as he scrolled through updates from their sources. It's worse than we thought, he muttered. They're not just making arrests. They're raiding homes, pulling people off the streets. Zaylen's fingers tapped against the leather seat, his jaw tightening. Graves had escalated. Not just a distraction anymore. This was a calculated attack. Gabriel Langford, seated in the front, exhaled sharply. They're pushing you into a corner, he said, forcing you to play defense instead of offense. Zaylen smirked slightly. They're assuming I have a corner to be pushed into. Elliot turned onto a side street, slowing as they approached a small neighborhood grocery store. The lights inside were still on, but the place looked shaken, like something had happened here. Because it had. Zaylen was out of the car before it even stopped. Elliot barely had time to throw it into park before he and Gabriel followed. Inside the store, the shelves were stocked, but the energy was heavy. The few customers inside were silent, tense. Behind the counter, Ruben Torres stood frozen, talking to an older man in a button-up shirt. His boss, Javi Morales. The second Ruben saw Zaylen, his shoulders sagged with relief. Zaylen stepped forward, his voice steady. They were here. Ruben nodded slowly, his face tight. Yeah, they were here. Javi exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. A few officers stormed in an hour ago, asked about Ruben, about you. One of them even leaned over the counter and reached for the security tapes. Zaylen's expression didn't change, but Elliot caught the way his fingers curled into a slow fist. Gabriel frowned. They were looking for the video. Ruben scoffed. Too late for that. It's already all over the internet. He looked back at Zaylen, his expression uneasy. They tried to get me to come with them. Zaylen's head tilted slightly. Tried? Ruben smirked a little, shaking his head. Javi shut him down. Said if they wanted me, they needed a warrant. Javi crossed his arms. Damn right I did. Zaylen glanced at him. Javi was old enough to remember when the system had been even worse than it was now. The kind of man who had seen everything, feared nothing. He nodded slightly. Appreciate it. Javi waved a hand. Look, I don't know what's going on with you and these cops, but I do know one thing. When men like them start moving this aggressively, it means they're scared. He leaned forward. So what's next? Zaylen didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to Ruben. You okay? Ruben nodded. Yeah, He exhaled. I don't get it, man. I'm nobody. Why would they come after me? Zalen's gaze didn't waver. Because you have proof, and because you did something most people don't. Reuben frowned. What's that? Zalen's smirk was slow, knowing. You told the truth. Meanwhile, police headquarters. The tension in Chief Whitaker's office was suffocating. Deputy Commissioner Lionel Graves stood near the window, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Grayson Holt and Pierce Calloway were seated, both looking tense. Whitaker paced behind his desk. Do you have any idea what the hell you've done? He snapped at Graves. Raiding homes? Dragging civilians into this? Graves finally turned, his smirk lazy, unbothered. It was necessary. Whitaker's nostrils flared. Necessary? You just turned this from bad press into a civil rights nightmare. Graves chuckled. Oh, Gerald, always thinking small. Holt sat forward, his arms on his knees. If we let Wade keep running unchecked, this department goes under. Everything we built, gone. Whitaker exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. What exactly is your endgame, Lionel? Graves stepped forward. Simple. We push him into a corner, force him to play dirty. And when he does, his smirk widened. We paint him as the real threat. Calloway nodded. Make him look like the bad guy. Whitaker wasn't convinced. And what if he doesn't take the bait? Graves's smirk faded slightly. Then we raise the stakes. A knock at the door made them all turn. A uniformed officer entered, looking nervous. Sir, he said, nodding at Whitaker before glancing at Graves. We have a problem. Graves frowned. What kind of problem? The officer hesitated, then handed a tablet to him. Graves's eyes flickered over the screen. The moment he saw what was playing, his smirk vanished. It was a live video feed. Not from the news. Not from an official broadcast. It was Zalen Wade. Back at the grocery store, Gabriel's phone buzzed, and when he glanced at the screen, his eyebrows shot up. Zalen, he muttered. It's live. Reuben frowned. What's live? Gabriel turned the phone around, showing the screen. It was Zalen. The camera was steady, the lighting dim, his face cast in shadows. His voice was calm, steady. The people in charge don't want you to know what's really happening. Reuben's breath hitched. Oh, damn. They want to control the narrative. They want to make you believe that the ones getting arrested, getting dragged from their homes, are criminals. But that's not the truth. At police headquarters, Graves was frozen. The live video feed was spreading like wildfire. Zalen's voice was a slow burn, a deliberate strike. This isn't law and order. This is a cover-up. They want to scare you into silence. They want to erase the truth before you even know what it is. Back at the store, Reuben swallowed hard. They're gonna lose their damn minds. Gabriel smirked. That's the point. Zalen's voice continued. But they made one mistake. They forgot who I am. At headquarters, Graves clenched his jaw. Back at the store, Elliot let out a low whistle. Oh, this is about to get messy. Zalen's final words sent a shockwave through the city. I am not afraid of them. And neither should you be, because as of tonight, I'm taking everything back. The screen cut to black. At police headquarters, Graves slammed the tablet onto Whitaker's desk, his face twisted in anger. Find him. Now. The city was awake now. Within minutes of Zalen Wade's live broadcast, the internet exploded. Social media feeds flooded with clips of his message. News outlets scrambled to verify sources, and the people who had spent years being silenced by corrupt cops and city officials were suddenly speaking up. But inside police headquarters, the atmosphere was the opposite. Chaos, panic, and desperation. Deputy Commissioner Lionel Graves stood in the center of the operations room, his fists clenched at his sides. Officers scrambled, phones ringing, monitors flashing with live footage of protests forming in multiple districts. People weren't just watching anymore. They were mobilizing. Sir, we've got confirmed gatherings outside multiple precincts, one officer reported, his voice tight with tension. They're demanding answers. Some of them are holding up signs with Wade's face on it. Graves exhaled sharply, his eyes burning with fury. Shut it down, he snapped, before this gets any worse. Chief Gerald Whitaker entered the room, his face pale as he tossed a tablet onto the table. It's already worse. Graves glanced at the screen. His stomach twisted. New headlines were rolling in by the second. Salem Wade speaks out, claims police corruption at the highest levels breaking, anonymous source leaks. Decades of misconduct reports. Are we watching the fall of the city's police leadership? Graves gritted his teeth. He had spent years covering tracks, making sure his people never got caught. And now, it was all unraveling. Whitaker wiped a hand down his face. I told you this was a mistake, he muttered. We should have handled this quietly. But no, you had to push him. And now, he gestured at the screens. We're losing control. Graves's eyes darkened. Not yet. Holt and Calloway entered the room, both looking tense. You wanted us? Holt asked. Graves turned to them, his tone sharp. We need Wade brought in. Tonight. Calloway hesitated. Sir, after that broadcast, if we go after him now, it'll look like retaliation. Graves's glare could have burned through steel. It is retaliation. Whitaker's voice was low. And if we can't find him, Graves smirked, slow and cold, then we force him to come to us. Holt frowned. How? Graves turned to the screens, scrolling through recent arrest reports. His smirk widened when he saw a familiar name. Ruben Torres. Graves tapped the screen. Bring him in. Holt hesitated. But he hasn't done anything. Graves turned to him, his expression dangerous. Neither did Wade when you two beat him in the street. Did that stop you? Holt fell silent. Calloway shifted uncomfortably. This is risky. Graves shrugged. That's the point. Wade made this personal. Now, so do we. Meanwhile, Zaylen's estate. Zaylen sat at his desk, his face illuminated by the glow of the monitors. He was watching. Every precinct, every street, every reaction. Elliot Crane stood nearby, arms crossed. You did it, he muttered. You got their attention. Zaylen exhaled. Now we see what they do next. Gabriel Langford was already typing, pulling up financial records, legal documents, every possible weakness. It won't take long, he said. They'll retaliate. As if on cue, Zaylen's phone buzzed. It wasn't a call. It was a video. Zaylen pressed play, his expression unreadable as the footage loaded. The video was grainy, dark, shot from a shaky phone camera. But the moment the voices became clear, Elliot's entire posture shifted. Ruben. The video showed officers dragging Ruben Torres out of the grocery store, forcing him into a squad car. Zaylen's jaw clenched. Gabriel swore under his breath. They're making a move. Elliot's fingers curled into fists. They're using him as bait. Zaylen remained silent for a long moment. Then finally he stood. Get the car. Gabriel frowned. Zaylen, think about this. I have, Zaylen said simply. And I'm done playing chess. Elliot smirked. Time to flip the board? Zaylen's smirk was slow, dangerous. Time to burn the table. Police headquarters. 1 hour later. The precinct was on high alert. Officers stood outside, scanning the streets for any sign of Wade. Inside, Ruben sat in an interrogation room, handcuffed to the table, trying to mask his fear. Across the hall, Graves was pacing. Has Wade made contact? He demanded. Holt shook his head. Nothing yet. Graves smirked. He will. But he didn't have time to enjoy his confidence. Because the next second, the power cut out. The entire precinct was thrown into darkness. A few emergency lights flickered on, but officers were already reaching for their weapons, their radios crackling with confusion. What the hell? Graves muttered. Then in the faint glow of the backup lights, a single black SUV rolled up outside the precinct. Elliot Crane stepped out first, his movements slow, deliberate. He leaned against the hood, arms crossed, smirking like he had all the time in the world. Then the back door opened. Zaylen Wade stepped out. Even in the dim light, the officers could feel the shift in power. Whitaker's mouth went dry. Oh, hell! Graves's smirk twitched. He came to us. But something was wrong. Zaylen wasn't alone. More vehicles pulled up behind him. Some sleek, professional. Others unmarked but unmistakable. Federal vehicles. Gabriel had been busy. Graves's heart dropped. From the second SUV, a woman in a sharp suit stepped out. Federal Oversight Division. and beside her, a U.S. attorney. The trap wasn't for Zalen. It was for them. The woman held up a signed federal warrant. "Deputy Commissioner Graves," she said, her voice crisp. "You're under investigation for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of abuse of power." Graves's smirk finally vanished. Behind him, Holt and Calloway took slow steps back. Zalen exhaled, his tone calm, controlled, final. "You forgot who I was." He took a slow step forward. "Now," his smirk returned, sharp and merciless, "you'll never forget me again." Outside, the city watched, and for the first time in a long time, justice wasn't just a word, it was happening. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.